In the year 1945, everyone already knew that Germany was going to lose the war. The Allied forces were approaching Berlin, the last Nazi stronghold from the west, while the Soviets were sweeping through the territory from the east. The city was being bombed daily. Its population was in panic, its troops demoralized, and opinions among the German high command were divided. Hitler and his most loyal men still believed in a miraculous victory, while their more pragmatic generals began to form plans for escape or surrender. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the confrontation that marked the end of the Second War in Europe, the Battle of Berlin in full color. Since the end of the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, German forces had begun to lose territory. The Soviets were advancing through previously conquered countries at great speed. Combined with the Allied invasion of Europe in June 1944, Germany's situation was desperate. Adolf Hitler was behaving increasingly erratically, issuing orders he would later contradict or demanding impossible feats from his generals. The Führer knew that his only chance of victory was to catch the Allies off guard. In December 1944, Germany launched what would be its last major offensive. Known as the Battle of the Bulge, Axis troops managed to surprise their enemies and break through the stagnant front. But the Allies were able to contain the advance, and a month later, the attack had ended. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Second World War. The German army suffered over 75,000 casualties, and its air force was extremely weakened. From this clash, the Nazis began a retreat that would not stop until the end of the war. Let's now listen to a historian talk about this battle.
The German attack in the Ardennes could have hit a number of U.S. units, but it hit a completely green one, and that unit melted away in the face of the German attack, and now there's a hole where the U.S. defenses used to be.
But despite the clearer path, Berlin was no longer a target for the Allies. They knew the Soviets were closing in, and believed that if both armies attacked the city simultaneously, there would be a great risk of friendly fire. Eisenhower, the leader of the Allied forces in Europe, had promised Stalin he could have the city. Discarding plans for a ground operation, they resorted to aerial bombardment. Starting from 1945, American and British planes began an extensive series of over 80 air raids. At one point, the Royal Air Force bombed the city for 36 consecutive days. The damage caused was extensive. Massive fires destroyed much of the buildings. Tens of thousands of Berliners died, and many more found their homes destroyed. Despite this, the greatest danger for the Germans came from another direction. The Soviets, fueled by a terrible thirst for revenge, were rapidly advancing along the Eastern Front, which stretched over 1,000 kilometers long. By mid-1944, they were already in Poland, the last stop before entering Germany. As they marched, the Soviets encountered evidence of the brutal war crimes perpetrated by the Nazis. In 1944, the first concentration camp, Lublin Majdanek, was liberated. Although it had been evacuated, the Germans did not have time to eliminate all evidence of their crimes. Thousands of prisoners were still there, living witnesses to the atrocities committed by the Nazis. From these discoveries, the chief of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, ordered that all prisoners in camps who could be liberated by the Soviet advance had to be transported inland to the Reich. This was not only because the Germans needed prisoners for forced labor, but also because they did not want more evidence of their crimes to fall into the hands of their enemies. But there was also another secret reason. Himmler suspected that Germany had no chance of winning the war anymore. The Nazi leader thought that, if necessary, he could use the detainees as hostages, bargaining chips with the Allies. Hitler couldn't find out. Any German showing a defeatist spirit risked being shot. The first transports of prisoners were carried out by trains or ships. However, as winter approached, they began to be done on foot. These transfers became known as the death marches. The detainees, weakened by months or years of inhuman conditions, malnourished and beaten, often could not endure the journey. SS guards were ordered to kill those who were unable to keep walking. Thousands were murdered during these marches. Many others died of hunger, exhaustion, or exposure to cold and snow. In January 1945, the most infamous of these marches took place. 9 days before the Soviets reached Auschwitz, 55,000 prisoners were forced to walk 56 kilometers in the harsh Polish winter. Between 9,000 and 15,000 died or were murdered. The survivors were sent to other detention centers to continue being tortured or to work until death. Although the advance of both the Soviets and the Allies liberated concentration camps, preventing these crimes from remaining hidden, the marches continued until the end of the war. We can now hear the testimony of a survivor.
Salimos 1000 y pico y llegamos 300. ¿Llegamos a dónde, me vas a preguntar? El transporte de la muerte, yo únicamente en la marcha a la muerte, me acuerdo que otra vez utilicé mi política defensiva. No fui adelante, no fui atrás, no fui en el extremo izquierdo, en la extrema derecha ni extrema. Me mantenía dentro de lo posible amontonado, con todo, para no recibir un bayonetazo en el costado, para que no me maten atrás porque no puedo más.
The largest defensive line remaining to Germany outside of Berlin was the Seelow Heights, just 90 kilometers from the capital. Here, Soviet and Nazi troops clashed on April 16, 1945. The battle was one of the fiercest of the war and the last pitched battle. The Germans had a good defensive position thanks to the terrain, but the Russians greatly outnumbered them in men and tanks. After 3 days and despite the high number of casualties, the Red Army troops led by General Zhukov managed to break through the defenses. Berlin was now just one step away. On April 20th, the day Hitler turned 56, Soviet artillery began a terrible bombardment of the city. The citizens of Berlin, taken by surprise by the proximity of their enemy, panicked. They weren't the only ones. While German soldiers were ordered to resist to the death or be executed for cowardice, several high-ranking Nazi officers began to plan their escape. In an effort to create a positive image before their enemies, Himmler ordered on April 21st the release of around 20,000 Jews from some concentration camps. In a meeting with members of the World Jewish Congress a few days later, he lied, saying that the crematoria in these centers were built to dispose of the dead from a typhus epidemic. Furthermore, he claimed that these places had a high survival rate, although each person released showed evidence to the contrary. Through Swedish intermediaries, he posed as the provisional leader of Germany, declaring that Hitler would be dead in the coming days and sought to surrender to the Americans. Eisenhower rejected this request, calling Himmler Germany's greatest war criminal. Meanwhile, German troops tried to contain the advancing Soviet forces in the Berlin suburbs, but the small number of soldiers, the poor equipment they had, and the low morale could not withstand the Red Army. Hitler, with his most loyal staff and his lover Eva Braun, was in an underground bunker in the city center. The Führer was in a state of delirium and still imagined that victory was possible. He ordered General Steiner to launch a counterattack that, according to the Nazi leader, would put Zhukov's forces on the ropes. On April 22nd, when he was informed that Steiner did not have the men or materials for such a task, Hitler concluded that everything was indeed lost. In a fit of rage, he blamed his generals for incompetence and treason. Ignoring his men's pleas to flee the city, he declared that he would not leave Berlin until the battle was over. This tirade was portrayed in one of the most famous scenes of the 2004 movie, Downfall.
Steiner konnte nicht genügend Kräfte für einen Angriff massieren. Der Angriff Steiner ist nicht erfolgt.
By April 23rd, the Russians were at the gates of the city center. Just over 80,000 Germans, including army, SS, and militia, were facing off against 1.5 million Soviets energized by the imminent victory. The Nazis had no chance. Many, despite orders to fight to the end, laid down their weapons. Others, however, fueled by blind fanaticism, hindered the enemy's advance. Among them were members of the Hitler Youth. boys and girls indoctrinated from an early age to idolize their leader and give their lives for him. Tens of thousands of them died during the street fighting in Berlin. The German forces were not enough to stop the Soviet advance, and the siege of the city was completed. The Nazis were completely surrounded. Helmuth Weidling, the general in charge of the defense forces, pleaded with the Führer to order an attack to break the encirclement. Hitler turned a deaf ear, oscillating between imagining that everything would go well and moments of anguish when he realized there was no hope. In the following days, while desperate Germans fought with all they had, the Soviets gradually approached the government district of Berlin. We can now hear the words of a historian.
Hitler's subordinates are entirely divorced from the reality on the ground because Hitler is divorced from the reality on the ground. Hitler does not comprehend that two Soviet army groups are smashing into the center of Berlin.
On April 28th, a report from the BBC informed of Himmler's attempts to negotiate peace with the Allies. When Hitler found out, he flew into a terrible rage, declaring it the greatest betrayal he had ever known. He stripped the leader of the SS of all his ranks and ordered that he be shot. His representative in Berlin, Hermann Fegelein, had tried to flee some time before, but he was discovered and arrested. Upon learning of the disloyalty of someone he had considered his most faithful subject, Hitler ordered his death. Not even being Eva Braun's brother-in-law saved him. In the early hours of April 29th, Russian troops came face to face with the deteriorated Reichstag building, the former seat of the German government. Capturing it would hold a symbolic value for the Soviets, similar to what the fall of Paris was for the Nazis at the beginning of the war. But it wouldn't be easy. Inside were fanatical groups of SS troops with nothing to lose. They knew that falling into Soviet hands was almost a death sentence. After a day of fierce fighting, the red flag was raised on the building's terrace. At the same time the Reichstag fell into Soviet hands, just a kilometer away, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in their underground bunker. The Führer knew the end was near. His last military order was to give Weidling permission to try to break the Russian siege. After poisoning his dog, he retired to his study with Eva Braun. Minutes later, the remaining personnel in the bunker heard a gunshot. On April 30th, 1945, the Nazi leader died. He had instructed his followers that his and his wife's corpses should be cremated and buried, as he didn't want his enemies to display them as war trophies. He sought to avoid the same fate as Mussolini, whose body had been mutilated by Italian partisans. Thus ended his 1,000-year Reich. It had lasted only 12, but it caused the deaths of over 75 million human beings. His remains would be discovered shortly afterward by the Soviets, although it wasn't until 1973 that they could confirm his identification. The Allies never found out, leading to various conspiracy theories claiming Hitler was still alive. They gained access to this information after the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's now listen to the testimony of a historian speaking about this.
Почему Сталин не сообщает союзникам?
Warum ließ Stalin seine Verbündeten im Dunkeln?
Здесь больше психологии,
Das ist
может
etwas
быть, чем,
kompliziert und hat psychologische
формальной
Gründe.
логики. Psychologisch,
Ein Wissensvorsprung ist
знать
stets
то,
von
что не
Vorteil.
знают другие, это всегда хорошо.
Es kann immer nützlich sein, ein
Обладать тайной,
Geheimnis zu
которой не
haben.
обладают другие, это всегда хорошо.
Hitler's successor was his friend and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. The new chancellor rejected the Soviet demand for unconditional surrender, ordering the battered and few remaining German troops that Berlin must be defended to the last drop of blood. One day after the Führer's death, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children with cyanide while they slept. Then they committed gunshot. Their bodies were also burned. With Goebbels off the stage, perhaps the last staunch fan of the Nazi Party, Weidling saw no reason for his men to continue fighting a lost war. On the morning of May 2nd, the German troops laid down their arms. Thus, the Battle of Berlin came to an end. It left a balance of approximately 80,000 Soviet and 100,000 German dead. The civilians who lost their lives were more than 120,000. The Red Army, hungry for revenge for the brutal actions of the Nazis in their territory, committed atrocities against the population. In addition to the multiple looting and destruction, it is estimated that between 90 and 130,000 women were raped in Berlin. Many thousands would end up committing due to the trauma caused. The city also faced a food shortage that the Soviets could not solve. Due to the havoc caused by bombing and urban battle, more than 1 million people had been left homeless. Let's listen to the testimony of a German survivor below.
And then they came downstairs to the basement, putting this cardboard on the table, telling the people in Berlin, Väterchen Stalin gave his troops the right to rape, to steal, to kill, to do whatever they want to do. And believe me, they did.
The Axis forces would continue fighting in the remaining conquered territories until May 8th. With the unconditional surrender of Germany on this day, after 6 long and bloody years, the war in Europe was over. But there was still work to be done on this front. Hundreds of Nazi generals and leaders had fallen into the hands of their enemies. Most of these would be tried in Nuremberg, but some had escaped. With Hitler and Goebbels dead, Heinrich Himmler became the most wanted by the Allied forces. After the failure of his attempts to achieve peace, he sought to hide from both the Allies and the Nazis. He changed his appearance, cutting his hair and mustache, hiding his glasses, and putting on a black eye patch. He posed as Sergeant Heinrich Hitzinger, a secret police agent who he himself had ordered shot for defeatism. Still in Germany, he was stopped at a checkpoint by 2 Soviets who suspected there was something strange about his behavior. On May 23, 1945, he handed him over to the British, and after routine interrogation, Himmler revealed his true identity. He insisted on speaking with the Allied leaders, but his requests fell on deaf ears. When a doctor was ordered to give him a checkup, Himmler bit down on the cyanide capsule he had hidden in his mouth. Within 15 minutes, he was lifeless. With Himmler's and the capture of other high-ranking leaders such as Hermann Göring and Karl Dönitz, the leadership of the Third Reich had collapsed. Despite what the German surrender meant, the atmosphere in the Reich capital was not happy. Unlike many other regions under Nazi control, Berlin was not liberated but conquered. There were no scenes of emotional celebrations, nor soldiers being welcomed with kisses and flowers. The remaining citizens now had to deal with mourning their dead and rebuilding their lives under the tense joint Allied and Soviet occupation. Still, many Berliners were relieved that the war was finally over, at least on their territory, and that the regime that had plunged them into it was in ruins. We reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, what do you think would have happened if the Allies negotiated with Himmler? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.